Good evening, everyone. I'm Tom Landy. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture at the College of the Holy Cross. And I'm pleased to welcome you here tonight to discuss the question of responsibilities of social media companies in repairing our social divisions. Our event tonight is one in a series of events under the banner Repairing the Fabric of Our Nation, conceived as a way to discuss how we as a nation have fallen as far as we have in recent years, in ways that culminated in the January 6th attack on the Capitol. It's almost a cliche to say that social media has played a significant role in creating, or at least inflaming, the divisions of our socio-political life today. We've heard about the echo chambers it enables. We know that it often entices people to write things that they might rightly hesitate to say in person. We know that it's designed to draw viewers to the most inflammatory postings, if that's what it takes to keep your eyes on the screen. We know that's a tool that enables terrible demagoguery and hate by bypassing the media filters that once existed. That this is a cliche doesn't mean it's true. But what do we do about it? How do we control that? Except that many of you are probably watching probably learned about this via social media. I'd otherwise be happy to see it go away, but I know that's not likely. Maybe it's not even desirable. But the damage that it's wrought, giving an unfiltered megaphone to some of our worst voices, is what brings us here tonight. I was only relieved after January 6th not to hear Donald Trump's latest, ugliest tweets. But others say to me, wait a minute, not so fast. They don't think it's a good strategy to have private monopolistic actors decide who gets access. So I've invited three friends to help set me straight on these questions. Dick Freije is a Holy Cross alum, the class of 1981. He's a Holy Cross parent of Christine of the class of 13 and Daniel, Matt, the class of 19. He's also a Holy Cross spouse of Margaret, the provost and dean of the college. Following his graduation in 1981, he completed a PhD in math at Brown and then a JD at Harvard Law. Today, he works in the legal division of Sun Life and also teaches classes in cyber law and Clark at WPI, which is what particularly drew us here today. Amit Taneja is the Associate Provost for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the College of the Holy Cross. And Daniel Klinghard is Professor of Politics and Director of the J.D. Power Center for Liberal Arts in the World at Holy Cross. There are a whole lot of issues that we could discuss related to social media, including the ways that algorithms create feedback loops, as I said, how they hide misinformation. But tonight's discussants are particularly qualified to talk to us about free speech and legal aspects. So that's our focus. That's what I asked them to do. And really, those are enormous enough issues. I've asked Dick to help us understand how the law looks at these issues today and what some of the implications are for any proposed changes. I've asked Amit to make the case for why people would call for more protection against hate speech on the web. And I've asked Daniel to make the case for why free speech needs to remain a fundamental value. They're free to mix up those roles in the process. We'll discuss that a little bit before opening your comments and questions to your comments and questions, which I will ask you to submit via Q&A. We're recording tonight, and if you do submit a question and want me to use your name, please let me know. Because this is a public event, we've disabled the chat. I'll start with Dick and ask him to talk about how the law treats all these matters, and then we'll turn to Amit and Daniel before we open to questions. So welcome, everyone. Welcome, Dick.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks for inviting me to be on this panel. So I thought I'd start by talking about why this is a hard question, why it's hard legally to hold the social media companies responsible for what happens online. And there are two reasons, really. The first is there's a law called Section 230 of the Telecommunications Act that really immunizes social media companies from lawsuits based on what's on their platforms. And you might say, that sounds crazy. Why would we do that? And the reason that law came into effect in 1996 is there were a couple lawsuits against early internet companies, CompuServe and Prodigy, that were sued for defamation for things people had posted on their sites. And the way the courts were coming out is they were saying, we're going to treat you as a publisher, Prodigy in particular, because you do moderation. So if you moderate your site, we're going to hold you responsible for everything on it. And Congress said, that's a bad idea, because if the law stays unchanged, it's going to encourage sites to not moderate anything. It'll be a free-for-all. And we want sites to be able to do that. So they passed Section 230, which says the social media sites won't be treated as publishers of what goes on their site. So if you're not a publisher of defamation, you can't be sued for defamation. And it gives them broad liability protection, a broad liability shield. So since that law has come into effect in 1996, the courts have interpreted it very broadly. So it gives the social media companies a great deal of freedom to allow what they want on their site, to moderate as they will. It doesn't mean moderation has to be fair or neutral or anything like that, but they can't be held liable for what's on their site or their choices of how to moderate. And that's what Section 230 has brought us. The other law that's in play, of course, is the First Amendment. And you might say, well, why can't we just force the social media companies to get hate speech off their platforms? They can take it off. They try to do that, some of them. The reason we can't force them is because that would violate the First Amendment. Twitter, Facebook, they have First Amendment rights, just like you and me. And at least under our current understanding of the First Amendment, direct regulation of what they can do and how they moderate would violate the First Amendment, and those laws would be unconstitutional. So that's kind of the quandary we're in as people are trying to figure out from a regulatory basis how to force these social media companies to take responsibility for what shows up.
Let me turn to Daniel and maybe make the case for maybe, I set out in terms of saying why I'm glad to see all this gone. What's the argument that I'm wrong? You're often good at telling me that, so.
I try. I'm going to put up a little PowerPoint just to help me sort of control my thoughts here. So I'm skeptical that we can solve this problem of hate speech online by pressuring social media companies to more heavily moderate content. The evidence so far of the practice of speech codes online and generally suggests that they will not help and that they will cause more trouble for the very people who advocates are trying to help, people who advocate these kind of policies. Instead, what I would recommend we do is engage in what Lawrence Lessig calls a strategy of translation that aims at finding a current reading of the original Constitution that preserves its original meaning in the present context. In other words, even if First Amendment freedoms don't technically apply in this space, we need to ask if we would be better off coding the internet, so to speak, to preserve the same space for free speech that works as it does in the real world. This is because the internet generally and social media particularly, although they are controlled by private corporations, essentially function as something like our town square. It's the space where we turn to figure out what's happening, to say what we want, and to find others who think like us. It's one of the most important places, says the Supreme Court, for the exchange of views today. And so we must be especially cautious that we don't regulate ourselves out of a town square. So what I'll suggest here are three reasons why we should be very cautious, and maybe if I have time, three suggestions as to what we might do instead. So first of all, the effort to remove some forms of speech from the internet will reduce the overall quality of speech on the internet in unintended ways. And this is especially true of calls to abolish Section 230. Here's an example. This is an image that was banned from Facebook. Can you tell why this image was banned? Can you tell what the message of this image is supposed to be? It was banned because the depiction of a Klansman was deemed to violate Facebook's community standards because it does clearly depict the Klan and clear Klan imagery. Now, the image pretty obviously uses hateful imagery to undermine hate, but its removal points to both the difficulty of effectively drawing the lines at the boundaries of acceptable speech and the potential for overcautious line drawing that would reduce our capacity for expression online. Number two, online speech is distinctly vulnerable because of the technical ease with which it can be blocked compared to other traditional forms of speech. This means we should insist on very careful and robust constraints on the power that exists now before we empower more restrictions. So if you're on the left, you might be pleased that Amazon removed Ryan Anderson's book, When Harry Became Sally, a response to the transgender movement, despite the book being a big seller on Amazon. But you probably aren't thrilled that Facebook disappeared an article on San Diego City Beat that critiqued high-profile men involved in sexual assault scandals titled, "Dear Dudes, You're All Trash," for violating those same community standards. But you should be concerned that both decisions were made without explanation and without appeal. Finally, in places where speech codes have been enforced, they've consistently been enforced in an overbroad manner in ways that ironically hamper the speech of marginalized communities. This should not be surprising. It's hard to understand how people who are marginalized in real life could have faith that states and corporations would honor their personhood and their desires online. So in France, the head of the Paris chapter of ACT UP was fined for calling a defender of traditional values a homophobe. Pro-Palestinian activists have been fined for passing out brochures that said, "Buying Israeli products means legitimizing crimes in Gaza." In Poland, an atheist performer was criminally charged for saying that the Bible was unbelievable. There's little reason, in short, to believe that the restrictions we want for others won't be used on us. The good news is there are alternatives, and I'll just quickly go through a few. One is enhanced competition. The more powerful social media companies are, the harder it is for market forces to control them. Why should Facebook get to own Instagram rather than competing with Instagram? Second, instead of working to silence some, work to give voice to all. This is the recommendation of this book by Suzanne Nossel called Dare to Speak. She argues that safeguards for speech have been essential to virtually every form of social progress attained by democracies, and ensuring speech access and amplification to everyone is the best way to ensure future progress. And finally, we should create content that can build legitimacy. Imposing bans on speech implies a moral hierarchy that undermines the civic equality and trust that we need to get out of this situation. And it only feeds into our current obsession with owning the other side, demonstrating the maliciousness of the other side. We need to instead focus on building media that has the capacity to unite and build trust rather than the capacity to restrict speech. Thanks.
Thanks. I like that. I may push you later about the possibilities of doing that latter thing that you talk about. But Amit, could you make a case a little bit more about why now more than ever people would like to control what's on the internet, what's on the web?
Sure. Sorry, this is Hobbs. He likes to make guest appearances, so he'll just be here. So a couple of things. One, I mean, I think just as a broad statement, I do think that the internet and social media has really provided an unprecedented platform for historically marginalized voices to actually make their case and to take it directly to the people. In the past, movements, organizations, organizers on the margins had to rely on the filtered reporting of mass media to actually get their story out. And often it was not the message that they wanted out there. So I want to be, I do agree with Daniel that there could be some really unintended consequences of going overboard here. So in general, I think social media can be very helpful in giving more voice and a bigger platform to the voices that have not had the infrastructure to get their message out broadly. So that I want to start there. But I also acknowledge at the same time that if you look at the larger context in which we find our society, the Southern Poverty Law Center, for example, has tracked the ongoing rise of hate groups in this country, right? So we're seeing more and more organized forms of hate groups, more hate groups. And a lot of that organizing is happening in a similar way through social media, maybe through some less popular sites, but it is happening online quite a bit. And we do know a fair amount about the role of social media in the insurrection, right? That didn't just happen on its own. The other piece I want to acknowledge, just as studying the context here, is that there is a massive generational divide in how folks think about regulating speech. Older generations, and particularly, I use that term a little loosely here, but maybe I shouldn't. but folks who maybe fought for free speech in the 60s and 70s were, think about it as a hard fought right. But younger folks, and I hear that with students as well, they're a lot more comfortable with regulating certain forms of hate speech. In their mind, they're more black and white thinking on what constitutes hate speech versus maybe older generations might not have a clear sort of line on it. One other thing I want to say about sort of the context, right? Like, I think that we think that at some level free speech debate is focused on American exceptionalism in some ways, that we are the best and we know how to do this. And when there are other models, like Canada being one of them, where other progressive countries have figured out a way to do that balancing without doing massive amounts of overreach or restriction. The other thing that I think about a lot is the impact of hate speech on social media sites on historically marginalized populations in particular. There are groups of young people in particular, whether they be transgender or people of color or people with disabilities, who see ongoing use of milder levels. I think there are degrees of hate speech, but they're exposed to a much more ongoing violence of and marginalization that over time can have a very severe impact on the mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual health of those who are vulnerable. And while I do believe in allowing as much freedom of expression as possible, the reality for many of those people on the margins is that it comes at a cost. So one of my former faculty members, Dawn Johnson from Syracuse, she has this wonderful quote about, no matter what the pedagogical value of sort of having that open dialogue around controversial issues, there's something to be said about having one's dignity and humanity sacrificed on the altar of good pedagogy time and time again. So so in a number of ways, I think there are some cases to be made. I am not saying outright, just left, right, and center, let's start going and banning speech. But is there a way in which we as a community, as a nation, can have set standards around what is acceptable and what's not, and have a role in helping the social media companies actually enforce it. So I'm not an advocate for let the social media companies decide that on their own, let the government decide it on their own. I'm not advocating for any of that, but is there a way in which, could you imagine like a presidential commission that tries to come up with rules that that Congress passes, that comes up more as like a national town hall, right? A resetting of who are we as a country. And at the end of the day, the last point I would make around this is moderating social media is treating the symptom and not the cause, right? It's just one place where some of this is playing out. It's what is going to happen. It's not going to, the kind of moderation is not going to change hearts and minds for people who are holding prejudiced thoughts or have those kinds of attitudes. And we're seeing the pretty drastic rise of those kinds of attitudes in this country, that moderation alone is not going to fix it.
Thanks, Amit. I appreciate the reminder of the ways that Black Lives Matter movement and other movements, what we know about Ahmaud Arbery or George Floyd or Breonna Taylor, if it weren't for social media. So I see a corrective there. And certainly I want to turn to each of you to see what questions you have for each other. I'm supposing, Dick, maybe I'll start though, if I can throw one in while you're doing that. If Amit's proposal that there be some sort of national conversation or commission, at least what are the constitutional chances of that, or tell us how that might work out.
Yeah, I think that if it was to control the content of what was going online, I think that almost immediately that would be viewed as unconstitutional. Anytime the government, puts a thumb on the scale on the side of content, or particularly on the side of viewpoint, those rules will almost always be unconstitutional. So I think it's very tough within our system to do that. I think there's, some reconsideration of how the Constitution might apply to the internet, might help us out of this a little bit. I was interested in Daniel's quote from the Packingham case that talked about the thinking of the internet as a public forum. So, a lot of people that think of it that way say we should genuinely treat it as a public forum and impose access regulations and say, except in very extreme circumstances, Facebook shouldn't be able to throw anybody off, or Facebook shouldn't be able to throw anybody off. Governor DeSantis in Florida proposed a law that would say during a political campaign, the social media companies should be required to maintain the voice of the candidates. I think his proposal both runs into Section 230 problems and First Amendment problems. But when you think about free speech on the internet, there's this dichotomy between the free speech of the folks who are speaking and posting on the internet and the free speech rights of the platforms. And until we consider those differently and separately, I think we run into a lot of dead ends. So if I get to ask a question, I'd like to ask Daniel what he thinks of that. I mean, when you think about access and treating the internet as a public forum, would you be in favor of regulations that require the government to treat it as a common carrier? Will take everybody unless they're committing crimes.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting proposal. I would just say, to Amit's point about the presidential commission, and you're expecting this. We talked about this the other day. You would expect a different kind of result if President Trump was the president than if President Obama and President President Biden were in office, and Trump did try to create this 1776 commission to do something kind of similar to shape this. To Dick's question, I think the important thing that we have to ask ourselves is, what are we trying to preserve in applying the free speech rights that we have under the Constitution to a private company? And what I think we want to be able to do is to recognize that if this space is being used like a public forum, and it is, right? And there's also not much else, right? I mean, it's like when I was growing up, we didn't have a town square. We did, but nobody went to it. We all went to the mall, right? And at the town square, you could do whatever you want. You could say whatever you want. At the mall, the security guard was going to chase you off if you were trying to express yourself in a certain way. We don't want to turn the internet into a mall where it's only corporate sanitized the language allowed. And so I think we have to be very careful that what we do is not give corporations either a kind of reflexive liability avoidance, where they're shutting off everything that could possibly get them in trouble, or a kind of fixation with meeting the regulations and in a way that first of all makes it harder for newcomers to enter into the marketplace, right? So the more regulations you have, the harder it is for new voices to come on, right? But also one that just gives, again, it gives corporations the incentive to turn it into a very clean, very tight, very smartly run kind of operation. I mean, part of the problem there is it's so easy for the internet for speech to be regulated on the internet. So if we give the social media giants a nudge, and we nudge them the wrong way, we may have gone too far. We need to think about a very precision guided regulation that's aimed at getting what we want, not just blocking what we don't want.
Precision guided is a violent metaphor. I just want to call you on that. So I don't mean to cut anyone off. Other comments?
I'm actually genuinely intrigued by the idea of competition allowing for that may be one way to solve it. Actually, I think that's a good idea. But one thought I had was, would competition then lead to more siloed forms of social media? So Parlor, 4chan on one side, and maybe Facebook becomes for a certain kind, and maybe you have lefty social media. I don't know what that would look like, or but you could imagine that you would have social media that just creates more echo chambers with more competition. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but that's kind of where my head went. I don't think it's a bad idea, but
No, that's absolutely, you're right. That's a bad direction. That's one of the, nudge a little bit and you go too far the other way. Parler's a good example, right? Because here's a group that's tried to be the conservative Twitter, the alt-right Twitter, or however they define themselves. And certainly what we see is online, Parler's used to do things like organize the insurrection. But the question there is how long term is that model, right? How long can you actually go with exclusively one little group of people? Part of this is it's not like the networks, it's not like the news networks where they're just delivering content in one direction. Social media benefits from the network effect, where it's more valuable the more people you have on it. And so to some degree, if you're on Parler, you're trading a certain kind of recipe, right? And not everybody likes to eat that same kind of meal every night, right? And so eventually, if there's a possibility for Twitter to lure them back by saying, look, we're not going to be hostile to your point of view as long as it's not violent or whatever, you might actually get a little bit of a push-pull between both sites or multiple sites to try to create an environment that will maximize that network effect while trying to create an environment that's pleasant for people to be in.
So I'm old enough to remember, and Daniel, you may be, we're using parallels about this where there are monopolies now, but certainly when I was a kid, we had 3, maybe 4 stations if we turn the antenna right, Now you go on cable and there are sort of hundreds of things, and they're really working hard to keep our attention. So news is very different from when I was a kid. There are chyrons going back and forth that constantly say, panic, be afraid, breaking news, whatever. So it's sort of driven that. Now, what's to believe that this world where there are lots of parlors or all these other places isn't simply going to be worse, but kind of drag people into their fears, because that's what it takes to get an audience in a world of multiple social media sites like that. I'll be dystopian, so it's my dystopian night.
It's a good time to be dystopian, Tom. That's the vibe we've all got going on this year. What's to keep it from happening? I mean, there's nothing to keep it from happening. I mean, that's obviously a danger. What my last suggestion, what I was saying that we should work on, is that we do have this problem with the mainstream media, right? So this is again, this is not all the fault of social media. A lot of these problems that we have, and I appreciate very much what Amo was saying, a lot of these problems are problems with our society, right? That we have this kind of this poison in our veins. I mean, one thing I think that is really at the heart of this is our geographic sorting, right? So do we have the internet that we want, or do we have the internet that our internet overlords have given us? Well, the internet looks a whole lot like the societies in which we live anyway. Very polarized, very siloed. That's the kind of thing that we need to get to in order to break this kind of cycle of just reporting to people who are just like you. And then when you go out the door, you see people who are just like you. And when you go on Twitter or Facebook or Parler, you're talking to people who are just like you, right? So I'm not sure that competition would solve that problem, but I'm also not sure that problem would go away if we just controlled what people were saying on the internet, right? The problem still exists with the nature of our society, with the way we're sorting ourselves in our lives. And here's a proposal, this is a Donald Trump proposal. I think one of the most interesting proposals that one of the most interesting policies that Donald Trump instituted was forcing the Department of Interior to close down its Washington offices and move to the Midwest, or in the West, where people are actually affected by regulations. Kind of a crazy idea, and part of the reasons that he did this, were not great. But if we decentralize government in that way, literally putting federal bureaucrats in communities that they governed or that they made rules for, it might actually enhance the legitimacy of government. In the same way with social media. Social media is destroying not only our culture, it's destroyed San Francisco, right? You have all this concentrated wealth, these concentrated social media giants hogging up all the land. If they disperse themselves across the country and they actually lived where people who are using their product were, things might change a little bit. They might have we might think differently of them, and they might see problems that we have in a little bit of a different light.
Dick, you look like you were going to say something earlier.
Yeah, no, I wanted to just say that I think that when you talk about, regulating speech on the internet, you can regulate speech in some ways without regulating ideas. So a lot of the problem with Twitter and Facebook is not the ideas that are being put forth, but how they're being put forth. Tim Wu, who's a First Amendment scholar in Columbia, talks about that there's too much speech on the internet, and speech itself is blocking speech. And what he means by that is people are afraid to talk because they're afraid they're going to get doxxed. They're afraid that their Twitter feed is going to be filled up with hate speech directed against them personally, and that's not going to stop. So I think that there's something in between saying we're not going to allow racist speech, between we're not going to allow someone to speak in a racist way directed at a particular individual. So whether that distinction is allowed by the First Amendment is an interesting question. Historically, the Supreme Court has allowed the First Amendment to be interpreted differently depending on the medium that was involved. So there's a very famous case involving the comedian George Carlin and the 7 words you can't say on television. That was broadcast over the air on the radio. It went up to the Supreme Court because the FCC fined the radio station. And the Supreme Court said, yes, you can fine them for that. Because of the nature of broadcast radio, we're trying to protect children. Somebody could just flip on the radio in their car and out could come this stream of profanity, and we can prevent that. If you think about trying to protect the free speech places on the internet, one way to do that is to paradoxically look at the speech that's preventing speech, that's saying, I can't be on Facebook anymore or Twitter, I've got to retreat to Parler. Or I can't go to Parler, I've got to retreat to lefty social media. I think those are very tough questions. I think it would be interesting if a social media company tried that form of moderation. I think that it might, who knows? I mean, it might get them somewhere. They're under no obligation to. Again, Section 230 says they can moderate how they want without really liability. And we can't really force them. But that's an idea I think that, might get us to, not say I want a right wing or left wing, but I want a family friendly. I'm going to, try and police how people are saying things, not what they're saying.
Yeah, I mean, we're only talking about hate speech here, but I think, Tom, you were alluding to just, bad information, like during misinformation, right? So
Disinformation.
Yeah, exactly. So during the elections, I do have a drunk uncle in the extended family, let's say, and I saw this post about the feds just confiscated 25,000 fake IDs, all Democrats coming from China. The election is going to be lost. Like this whole thing started long before November 6th, right? And he believes this. He totally believes this. And he's posting it all over, and people are talking about it. I just kind of had to block him for a few days and just say, I don't need you in my life right now. So that was one piece. And the second piece of it was, just COVID. My mom got a PhD in coronavirus from WhatsApp University. And I was getting texts all the day about drink vinegar and rub your face in this or that, and then you won't get COVID. And I was like, please stop. She actually just sent me one a couple of days ago. She's in Canada, and it was like, vaccines are here and they're being distributed. And I'm like, not 90% of what you said is the first line was correct, and then everything else below it was not. So there are also other bigger issues, right? I do think that there may be role for accountability for actions, right? So we're only thinking of the problem in a way that the social media companies are doing the accountability by restricting certain forms of speech. But if you're truly engaging in hate speech, right, or you're organizing an insurrection, then there is space for private employers to say, you can hold those views, you just don't need to work here because that's against our values. Now, that gets into cancel culture. That's a divisive term, but I do think there's some role for, and again, I get that it's very, very blurry, right? And it could lead to restricting many forms of, we need to be able to engage with controversial ideas. So I'm not saying, again, just blanket rules, but maybe there's a role for private employers to be able to say, this does not represent our values. And you can hold those views, you just don't have to work here.
So the irony that we have is that if the government can't fully intervene in it, we're just going to make private actors, we're going to give that. And we do that in many ways in our lives.
Sure.
Daniel?
Well, I was just going to say, this is one place where the internet has actually gotten better, right? There's not a lot of ways that it's gotten better. But if you remember back in the very early days, everybody was anonymous, and you could just be anonymous relatively easy. That's harder now, and that leads to things like what you're saying, Amit, where you show up, the guy who showed up to the Capitol and had, for whatever reason, his employer ID tag that said the name of his company, and sure, I mean, I think in that situation where you can put a little bit of personal liability on these things, I think that suits the First Amendment just fine, right? Because if your employer can fire you because you're saying something awful or saying something that brings disrepute on the company.
The old cartoon on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. That was a long time ago.
Well, I also think that, but there is, with growing polarization, some folks like the realtor, right? The realtor who flew in on a private jet, like she's promoting, like, come to my business because I'm one of you, because she knows this is not necessarily just a fringe. It's going to speak to a certain percentage of the population that's going to say, if I'm going to hire a realtor, it's going to be that, woman who went to defend my freedom, right? That kind of thing. So there are folks who are actually, they're well aware of accountability measures. And I'm sure that she went in knowing that there's certain people who would not want to hire her as a realtor, but that's her brand. The My Pillow guy is using his brand to sell pillows. So there's some folks who are, they just don't, the accountability measures alone might not work because we're so divided, right? It's not like, it's not a 20-80 divide. It's like, much closer to 50-50, 47-53.
I want to take one of the questions that's come in. We've touched on moderation in a number of ways. And one of our attendees wants to know, the reasoning behind regulating speech is most often hate speech. But what is defined by hate speech, and who gets to define it? So we can use that and maybe get in from there to saying, what are the ways we moderate that? Because there are some attempts out there right now. And are they the people who should be moderating that? There's the Facebook star chamber, I guess, whatever Zuckerberg is calling it, of people who get to decide this. But
okay, was it Clarence Thomas who did the whole famous I don't know what obscenity or pornography is, I can't define it.
Was way before him.
Yeah.
Okay, but it was one of the Supreme Court justices, right? Like, I don't know what it is, but when I see it, I know it. I'm joking.
Lewis Powell, maybe.
I think Lewis Powell. Yeah.
Lewis Powell. Okay.
That's what popped into my mind, Tom.
You'd know better.
Yeah. So it's an interesting question. It depends a little what you mean by hate speech. So hate speech is not a category really recognized by the First Amendment. So I'm going to speak as a lawyer here, and I'll let everybody answer the harder part of the question. There are categories of speech that are you can punish by criminal or penalties or otherwise. Obviously, defamation is one. You can be sued for defamation, and you don't have a free speech right to defame someone. What's called the true threat, which is really threatening harm to someone in an imminent way. But under the Supreme Court interpretation of the First Amendment the way it is today, a lot of what you would consider hate speech, racist speech, for example, is clearly protected by the First Amendment. And that's been true for a long time. A very famous First Amendment case about allowing the Nazis to, the Nazi Party of America to march through Skokie, Illinois. And they wanted to do it because at the time it was a town that had a lot of Holocaust survivors. And that's clearly hate speech. It was directed at those people, and it's protected by the First Amendment. To the degree that the platforms want to root out hate speech, I think one of the objections to the way they've done it is that it does seem arbitrary. What's hate speech yesterday is not hate, is hate speech tomorrow, and the rules keep changing. I think that we would all be better if those rules were made more apparent to people. People could know if I say this on Twitter, I'm liable to get kicked off. The rules have changed because the perceived harm from what's going on has changed so fast. So I have some sympathy for, for Twitter putting up with President Trump's tweets, which were often false for a very long time before they started to label them, and then putting up with his labeled false tweets for quite a long time before they felt like they had to throw in the towel. But it is kind of a moving target. And how do you decide? I mean, I think that if the social media companies are going to try and make those decisions, they should try and make them publicly and get input as to how people, how their customers want them to define hate speech.
One way to test how you feel about that question is, who do you feel comfortable deciding the answer to that question, right? I mean, at some level, we think about speech as being, sort of a search for the truth, and that's true. That's a part of it, but it's also about our discomfort with giving people authority over something that's so fundamental and so close to our conscience, that we really want to be careful who we give that power to, especially today, where there's not a lot of institutions that have universal support in our country today. So to the other question there about do we blindly revere the Constitution? It's not that I blindly revere the Constitution, and not that question is necessarily aimed at me, but we shouldn't blindly revere the Constitution. But at a certain point, you get back to the thinking that led them to the Constitution, which is, this is a lot of power. It touches something very close to who people really are. Who do we trust to have that? And maybe we don't trust anybody.
Uh-oh. And
Dystopian.
these mechanisms that have been set up then to, I guess there's something new today. What was it, Dick, in the Atlantic you were mentioning? There's Zuckerberg's group that's supposed to moderate this, or there's self-moderation that's supposed to happen.
Twitter, yeah, Twitter's trying to crowdsource moderation, or not really moderation, but fact checking. So they want to get, it's called Birdwatch, which I think is a great name. And the idea is that the people on Twitter can help Twitter find the really false things on Twitter and help root them out, to the degree Twitter's trying to get the false stuff off of Twitter. Again, what's false and what's accepted as false and true changes over time. And so there's a real danger in doing that in a lot of ways, but some things are obviously false. The election, the voting machines in the Midwest didn't change votes. And I think the people that are still tweeting that, I'm pretty sympathetic of Twitter trying to get that off their site.
And just to clarify a little bit, when we've talked about First Amendment rights and how they apply. So if you would just clarify, if Twitter takes away something, nobody's First Amendment rights are being violated. But on the other hand, if the government says Twitter can't do, that's a First Amendment question, or can you just help us out a little bit? Just to.
Yeah, well, the First Amendment, says Congress shall make no law. That's how it starts. And you should really read into that government shall make no law or take any action if you read it that way. That's how I tell my students to think of it. Twitter's not the government. So almost by definition, Twitter can't infringe on your First Amendment rights. There have been a few cracks in that historically in the way that the First Amendment's been interpreted, but very, very outlier situations. So a very old case called Marsh v. Alabama, I think, about a company town and whether Jehovah's Witnesses could go door to door in a company town. So the whole town was owned by a corporation, and they said it's private, and so we can keep everybody off. And they said, no, it's really filling the role of the public streets. And so you have to let people do this. There was a case, Dana brought up shopping malls. There was a case called Pruneyard versus Robbins, where First Amendment rights, at least in some ways, were applied against the private owners of a shopping mall. And so there are some people that think we should think of the internet that way, and maybe they could violate your First Amendment rights. The thinking mostly is they can't. Twitter can do what it wants. Twitter's not the government, so they can't violate your First Amendment rights.
So it's ironic that there's not a First Amendment question unless the government tries to do something about it, then it becomes a First Amendment question.
That's correct. Yep.
I'll go to a question that we had. This is more a commentary than a question, but I'd welcome a follow-up conversation. The idea that more speech in the marketplace of ideas would somehow tame down hate speech has not been borne out by the developments of the last decade. More free speech has led to more hate speech. Also, to piggyback on Amit's point, quote unquote free speech has been used as a form of ideological violence against marginalized groups. And perhaps it's a time to reconsider our almost religious fidelity to the Constitution. We did talk about the latter thing. Any thoughts? We're not going to get on here and overturn the Constitution, otherwise we'll get thrown off YouTube, right?
Yeah, it's a good point. I think that there is a question as to, why we feel like more speech has led to more hate speech. One of the things that happened with the internet, of course, that Daniel mentioned before, is that it's not all one-way speaking. And so you can find allies for whatever ideas you have on the internet. And that's going to lead to, people finding their allies, even if they have very ugly ideas. We've tolerated hate speech in the country for a long time. And I think you still do have to go back at some point to the Constitution, not a religious fidelity to it, but to say, who's going to decide what hate speech is? So is hate speech, making a comment that someone believes is racist? Is it hate speech to say that we, defund the police? Who's going to make that determination? And I think it's very hard to try and answer that question as to who can make that determination. Sorry, that's the best I can do, Daniel. I think that's a political science question, not a law question.
Ask another question. Unless you had some other. Okay.
I agree with everything he said.
Oh, good. It's beautiful.
Can I chime in really quickly? And so,
please.
I have a little bit of sympathy to I'm not saying get rid of the Constitution again, but how do we amplify other countries, I think, or other democracies that have had different outcomes than where we've ended up at? I think there's something that we can not, I should have disclosed from the beginning. I'm a dual citizen of Canada and the US. So on this topic, I tend to go a little bit more on the Canadian side. But I think there are ways in which we can learn from other systems. And so I have a little bit more empathy of broadening how we think of the Constitution. And there's, again, I believe in science, right? You start looking at research that's talking about long-term mental, physical health consequences for being subjected to this kind of treatment and speech over and over and over again, it's not just somebody's being a snowflake. It is actually literally taking years off some people's lives, right? And so that's where I think there's where we need to build more empathy and understanding. The solution, again, is for me is not just regulation, but what is it that we can do to change hearts and minds? Like, that's a much bigger question.
Thanks. So let me ask, we've talked about hate speech, but it seems to me that in terms of how this has been decided, some of it's been about violent speech, some of it's been about untruthfulness. Sort of what's been the line actually that's gotten people pulled off? Is it hate speech, or is it threats to violence? And if we're concerned about certain kinds of violence on the web, I'm struck that if a president of almost any country says, you know, if you're not careful to another country, we're going to bomb the crap out of you, that would not be removed. That kind of violence is somehow okay on the web, but then other kinds of violence are not. So how do we think about that? And what are the things actually driving this? And is it about violence if it is? Silence.
That's a tough question. I mean, it does get to the point that you know, there's hate speech, which it has sort of maybe theoretical content about other people, right? And then there's violent speech, which is a threat, and as Dick said, that's actionable in a different way than just abstract hate speech. I found, this isn't exactly what you were asking, but I found it really odd that President Trump was claiming his free speech rights to speak to the crowd. That's not, when the president speaks, that's not exercising free speech, right? When the majority speaks, right? When politicians speak, they are by definition representing majorities of people. They're not exercising free speech rights in quite the same way that I think we should, that I'm concerned about, right? There's a difference between majority speech, which can be hateful at times, or the speech of majority dominated politicians, which can be hateful. It's the person who is standing alone on the street corner when the cop tells him to move, who is exercising his or her free speech, right? Now, but then the issue then gets back to, you can't shut the president up, right? You can't. Or you can say, well, maybe there's a rule, you can't say these certain things, but the majority will express those opinions in another way, right? The majority is going to express those opinions even if it can't use certain kinds of words or certain kinds of concepts. So it's a little bit of a fool's errand to try to oppress people who have majority power, or to restrict people who have majority power from saying things that they will do whether they say them explicitly or not, right?
I have one closing question, but I don't know if there's anything that either three of you want to say before I do that. I guess I'd ask each of you if you would summarize your ideal solution to this, if you have one, and then really tell us kind of what outcomes we could predict. Like in terms of this question, so the series is based on our ability to heal a fractured nation. And I get a sense maybe that the internet isn't the place to be looking, but wherever you come down on this, if you have to, without magical thinking, but really realistic thinking, what's our future look like in terms of healing? We have to let go of the idea that the internet's going to help us do this? Do we have to keep pushing harder for the internet to do it? But what would your solution do for that healing or not do for it?
Well, I'll start. Right? A couple things. I think we have to remember that the internet's not all bad. So we're here because of the events of January 6th. And the internet certainly had a lot to do with fomenting that. In looking back at some articles about the internet and in preparation for this, I was struck at the number of articles that were written in 2017 about the place of Facebook in the creation of the Women's March, which is really a beautiful example of people expressing their free speech rights together. So I don't know if people know this, the Women's March started because someone the night of the election who was upset about the election just on a whim started a Facebook event. Let's have a women's march. And the next day, 10,000 people were signed up. And by the time January came around, there were millions and millions. That probably couldn't have happened without Facebook. Maybe January 6th couldn't have happened without Facebook either. So how do you keep one and not the other? To me, I think that the hope is that when from a legal perspective, when we think about how we're dealing with the internet, we keep in mind kind of what Daniel said, the free speech rights of the people who are using the internet, and the manner in which the code, if you will, this is Lawrence Lessig's idea, the code is kind of built in to allow so much speech that it blocks other speech. Maybe we can sort that out. I think that would take a different interpretation of the First Amendment. It's not one that's unheard of in history. To date, when the Supreme Court has thought about the First Amendment in the internet, they said the internet deserves the broadest protection possible of the First Amendment because it's such an open forum. I think that's true with regard to you and I who want to express ourselves on Twitter. I don't think that's true about Facebook and Twitter themselves. And I think if we can distinguish those, not that they're not valid First Amendment actors, but if we can distinguish them in their place in making the speech possible, I think we can get somewhere.
Thank you. Amit?
I would agree with a lot of pretty much everything that Dick just said. I'll go back to, so I don't think there's one solution. I think there's like an array of solutions here. And so the only thing I would add to it is like amplifying that accountability piece, that and people being more public about that. I think a lot of companies have done that as a reaction, right? But how are places developing policies to make that clear? Like when you're out there, you're representing us and this is not who we are. Again, it comes with a whole bunch of minefields there. I'm not negating that, but I think there's something that social media companies can do and something that other private employers can do that is changing. It's more about changing the culture about what we will consider acceptable.
I agree, and I think that the problem isn't that our society is infecting the internet. It's that the internet is affecting our society. It's that our society is affecting the internet. And I think that means that there's a lot of hard work to do. On one side, I agree completely with Amit about developing empathy and sort of publicizing and understanding and helping people understand these kinds of problems. And I think helping amplify those voices of the people who are being hurt on the internet, giving them opportunities through the internet to express both their hurt but also their aspirations, right? And not just to kind of negative this, but helping people, pointing to people who are expressing their aspirations. The other thing I think we need is just, and this is the hard thing. Nobody on this chat can do this effectively. I don't think. Maybe I don't know. There's a couple of the Jesuits on there. They probably have a better grip on personal control. A lot of it has to do with our personal habits. We've just got to change our personal habits, and we've got to demand, not as a government practice, but as from the standpoint of consumers, we've got to demand more from these companies. And we could, maybe the only way we can demand more is by the way we actually use those products, right? And so some of this means teaching our young people about information literacy. And some of it just means, realizing, as this is how I gave up Twitter. I realized just how I was looking to get angry every time I got on Twitter. And I realized there's something really wrong with that. I have a lot of other problems that I can't control as well, but I do think that there is a matter of what we as a society tell one another is normal about living online and communicating online and just spending time online. So that's not a very tight answer either, Tom, but I think that would be that's the kind of way we can change things without breaking our, the fundamental rights that actually matter more than just being able to find cat videos online. And that was a throw out to Hobbes.
Thanks to each of the three of you for, to borrow from your words in the closing, representing who we are, really helping us to think about how we grapple with the issues, how we do that as a community, and maybe aspire to be our best selves in an imperfect world that does not always reach out with easy solutions to us, but certainly brings up a lot of powerful needs that are in the balance with us. So thanks to everyone who joined us tonight, and our panelists. Have a good evening.